I would like to welcome you all to our webinar to celebrate the International Day for Monuments and Sites 2023. As you already know, and as we have already announced, that ICOMOS has defined this year's theme as Heritage Changes. So we are expected to discuss the heritage, cultural heritage, and explore and discuss the impact of climate change on cultural heritage sites and landscapes through a variety of approaches. We have so many different perspectives looking at cultural heritage, obviously, and we hope to discuss them with our very valuable guests. I would like to thank our speakers who have accepted our invitation, even it was kind of short notice. As you may know, things are a little bit hectic in our region, especially after the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. So we are trying to catch up with what is left behind. We are organizing this event on as Urban Research and Development Center of Eastern Mediterranean University. And we have been doing this since 2011, celebrating International Day of Monuments and Sites with different partners every year and with different events. So this year we are organizing this webinar. I'm not going to take too long, but I would like to give the word to our speakers. We have 4 valuable speakers today. They are all involved in cultural heritage and they have been working on the issue from different perspectives and their experience. Our event is supported by ICOMOS Sustainable Development Goals Working Group. And as I know, both Toki and Bayan are members of that group as well. I know that Zeynep Hoca, Ms. Eres is a member of, again, ICOMOS National Committee of Turkey. And Ege Hoca is Ege Oluca Tümer is from our university, our research center, and she is also a member of ICOMOS. So we are very honored to have our guests with us. I would like to start with, let me open my, I'm sorry. Yeah. Depending on the topics we have, I would like to give the first word to Dr. El Fawri. She's actually from Welsh School of Architecture in Cardiff, United Kingdom, and she's the chair of National Committee of ICOMOS Jordan in the Sustainable Development Goals Working Group. And her speech will be on climate change, heritage, and sustainable development goals, and she will focus on the case studies from Jordan. So I leave the floor to you, Dr. El Fawri.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I hope that you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So my topic for today is climate change, heritage, and sustainable development goals. I will focus my attention on the country of Jordan and draw some case studies from that context as well. First of all, I will start with a very broad understanding of the relationship between heritage and SDGs. We see cultural heritage as driver for equity and inclusive economic development. We see it as a tool on how we relate to one another, and how we imagine possible future. It's an enabler of social cohesion and inclusion, and it's an enabler to inclusive economic development and improve livability, resilience, and sustainability. So there has been many initiatives to link that relationship between culture and heritage and SDGs. These are just a few examples of them, but in my opinion, the most relevant of which is the policy guidance, ECOM's policy guidance, which shows exactly how heritage and culture can achieve the SDGs and vice versa. So the context of Jordan. Jordan is actually a country in the Middle East. It has 5 cultural sites listed and inscribed on the World Heritage List, and it has one site as a mixed property. However, Jordan is very rich in cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible assets all around the country, and this gives it an opportunity to have heritage included in the SDGs. However, there are many challenges facing the implementation of SDGs in general and SDG 13, which is climate change in particular. First is economic challenges. So Jordan is under the pressures of dependency of external financial support in many cases. There are also a reliability on energy from other countries. There's water scarcity and land degradation, desertification, and we have many political and institutional challenges, of which there is the continuous conflicts in the region, and the influxes of refugees from our neighboring countries, pressure of investments, and many more. So there are a number of challenges that we face to implement the SDGs. However, Jordan has been one of the first countries globally and in the Arab region to take actions toward the Millennium Development Goals, which has closed in 2015, and this laid the ground of their inclusion of the Sustainable Development Goals and adoption of many other memorandums, agreements, and initiatives for sustainable development. Jordan has also been very active in voluntary report as well as the United Nations team in Jordan, and in terms of climate adaptability, globally, there has become the climate change has become one of the greatest challenges in sustainable development. We are competing with greenhouse gas level continue to climb. We have there's the global mean temperature continue also to rise, sea levels rising. So that has many subsequent factors, subsequent consequences on the earth in general, including rising temperature, desertification, flood risks, and many more. That requires actually rapid and far-reaching transition in energy and land in all energy consumptions, and this goes hand in hand with the role of buildings and settlements and cities and how those can contribute to that initiatives toward resilient climate change. Design for climate adaptation actually reflects smarter, self-sufficient, and mitigate towards a changing environment. It can be implemented in indoor spaces and indoor environments such as rainwater harvesting, heating and cooling, and then also outside of the building such as resilient landscapes and many more. As a quotation of the policy guidance on how to achieve SDG 13 and what's their relationship to heritage and culture, we need to include heritage, particularly landscape-based, to community-wide solution, to look at the heritage-based techniques, knowledge, and social organization, to activate the participation of indigenous people and local communities in our fight towards the climate change, and to understand the role of heritage and acknowledge that participation in that respect. Also, we need to identify the local resources, resilient heritage-based techniques to prevent, mitigate climate change-related damage to heritage, and to include climate vulnerability assessment towards management policies. In Jordan in particular, it has been no change. It still faces increasing average temperature and declining average of precipitation. There's longer, drier season and more intense heat waves. There's also a study done by the Ministry of Environment that during the next century, the temperature will increase from 1 to 4 degrees. And just to understand what that means is 1 degree change would reduce the agricultural production by 3.5%. So this would reflect back on local communities, on culture, and on economic pressures as well. So therefore, Jordan has launched its first national policy on climate change in 2013-2020, and also produced a climate change strategic plan in 2014. It's mainly towards the two main themes: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is committed to reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 14%, and adaptation of that policy, as well as a methodology to integrate those into the planning scenarios. However, did I stop sharing? I didn't do that. Someone else is sharing, so that's why mine stopped.
Probably there was a mistake.
No
Sorry.
problem. Yeah, son, that's okay. So I'm just gonna go back. Okay, so there has been some separate initiatives done by different actors in order to include climate change in their scenarios. Of them, there's the Petra and UNESCO a trust project of sea stability, where they use the educational and awareness raising activities for young and children to mitigate disaster risk and climate change phenomena. There is the SHEB project that also works with the local communities and works with the local culture in order to promote resilient strategies on climate change. And there's the WANA Institute, who has developed the pathway towards sustainability, and it made all of their work towards SDG 6, 7, and 13. However, all of this is not enough yet. We need to be more than ever we need to work more than ever in order to include heritage site, local material, and lessons from vernacular architecture to contribute into climate change practices. People have adopted over the time and over the years. People have adopted several ways and to be a climate resilience, and there are valuable lessons that we now can carry to today's scenarios. We need to learn from those place-based knowledge and tradition, and to develop responsive strategies that can adopt local condition and landscape change, including architectural and agricultural adaptation. Many of those indigenous ways of knowledge support contemporary mitigation options, so we can use them toward today, and we can provide low carbon models for developing pre-urban areas. And then the characteristics of those local materials and architecture might be able to balance that built and natural dilemma that we have today. Use those both in order to promote climate change resilience. So I will showcase here one particular case study in detail on how vernacular architecture lesson can actually help us towards achieving some of those goals, and mainly SDG 13 in particular. So the case of Assault in Jordan, this city is 30 kilometers north west Amman, in the capital of Jordan. It is in the enclosure of 3 mountains, and it has a topography of a valley and then the 3 mountains. It has reached its importance because of a period of time called the Golden Era, which is estimated between 1885 to 1935. And in such a period of that relatively short, 30 years or so, that have been transformed from rural dwellings separated along the mountains to a very sophisticated city that many have said is the capital of Jordan before Amman. It has a very rich tangible and intangible heritage. The tangible heritage presented and manifested in those yellow limestone buildings terraced on the three mountains, and the intangible heritage of harmony between Christian and Muslims, of hospitality and urban tolerance. And that's why it has been inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2021 under the title of Asal, the place of tolerance and urban hospitality. So the first lesson we are going to learn from that vernacular architecture is the way that those buildings were sympathetic to the contour lines and to the contour lines, and actually terraced on the three mountains in a way that has maximized the view, maximized solar gain. Most of the orientations of the buildings were toward the south facade with more openings and still shaded openings, and then minimum openings on the north facade to include for winter seasons. And there's also many buildings have been had balconies with movable louvers, and another feature that can allow air circulation freely in the building. So the courtyard in those houses were actually a very important aspect of sustainable measures, where there are multiple courtyards in those buildings, whether it's in the middle of the house, whether it's on the rear of the building, surrounded or on multiple levels. Those courtyards have been proportionated in a way that allows adequate shading in summer and allows sufficient solar radiation gains during winter. There's opening or cross openings in those courtyards and on the main facades that allows cross ventilation. Actually, most courtyard had either a north courtyard and a south warm courtyard. These were designed to provide thermal comfort in a building by means of evaporative cooling and cross ventilation. The cold courtyard considered to be shaded in most of the daytime, so that it's meant to be shaded and it's meant to cool the air coming into the building, while the north courtyard is meant to be not shaded, so that it would increase the solar radiation gain into the building. The roofs and domes and vaulted roofs has also a very important aspects here. So the thermal capacity of the roofs allows the warm airflow to occur through the openings positioned on the far side of the wall. Still, the wind blows into the building through the opening facing the direction. Consequently, the internal warm air which accumulates below the roof would leave the building from the other side. So that is one of the attributes towards the leaving the smoothing out that period, that transition between the morning and the evening time. So the opening itself, the shape of the opening, it's more like tall arched openings with clear story windows, high ceilings in most of the cases, with interior courtyards, and looking into the interior courtyard, but also looking into the main facade with differences of louvers and shading devices. Mashrabiyya was not common, but it was used in most of the cases. One of the picture has it, so it's a grilled wooden window screens that are used to control the entry of the sun. And then the location and the size of the window has been also regulated in order to regulate the circulation of the air in the building. Placement of the openings as well bordering the courtyard is also very important. Clear story windows has been also used in order to allow this cross ventilation. Thermal mass actually is a very important aspect here, because the walls were actually very thick. It varies from at 80 centimeter to 120 centimeters. The material in between were all filled with rubble stone that allows as a natural insulation. Insulation, and it also came the material that has been used is locally produced by local quarries in a salt city itself, that also contribute to low the transportation energy and the quarries and the log material all from the city itself. Second of all, the material of plaster and lime washing. So the plaster and lime washing are the finishing material over those stone walls, and the plaster is used here in order to protect the bone stone and to reduce the temperature inside the building. The lime wash is also the decorative aspect, but also protect the plaster and lets the building to breathe. So that's the aspect. It's not like concrete. It allows the building to breathe and keeps it cool in summer and warm in the winter. So in conclusion, so feeding back to SDG 13 and feeding back to how all this and these lessons from vernacular architecture could contribute to SDG 13 is now we need to acknowledge what heritage can contribute to climate change, and we need to learn lessons from it, not only protect it but also use it in contemporary architecture by looking into the natural building material by relatively low energy content and lower transportation energy, by use natural thermal insulation, by use thermal massing, and understand actually the climate that we are in order to be able to understand how we need to mitigate those aspects and not actually just following the footprints of what's already there. We need to think of how these aspects were solved earlier on, so that we would think about a way and a methodology to conserve that and to fight against climate change in the next generations. So thank you very much. This is my presentation. I welcome any questions later on. I hope I didn't exceed my limits. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. El Fari. I think just for starting fast, I forgot to mention that we, in order to be able to answer the question of how do local and traditional knowledge systems contribute to developing viable climate adaptation measures, we reserved, under the Heritage Changes main team, we reserved our webinars team as vernacular settlements and climate action. With these, thank you for your contribution with the case of Jordan on how vernacular architecture or vernacular examples can contribute to climate change and climate action in your country. From here, I would like to move to Dr. Zeynep Eres from Istanbul Technical University, Department of Architecture in Turkey. And as I mentioned before, she is a member of National Committee of ICOMOS in Turkey. Dr. Eres is going to talk about documenting. Yes, her title is already here. So please, Hocam, I leave the floor to you.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
so thank you very much, Şebnem Hoca, and I also thank you for this invitation. And now my presentation will be focused primarily on the remnants of still existing vernacular architecture in traditional villages, validating them as indispensable cultural assets and thus to be considered among the responsibilities of architectural studies. In this respect, here we shall be exemplifying selected cases from our long-lasting documentary work carried out in various rural parts of Turkey. Now the second slide, is it okay? Yeah. Turkey, extending between southeastern Europe to the Near East, comprises a wide diversity of rural traditions. While northwestern parts of Turkey share similar traditions with those of the Balkans, rural architecture in southeastern parts of the country has common traits of the Near East. Our documentary work in these regions, while demonstrating how extensively rural architecture could be diversified even within a restricted area, and also revealed a vivid picture of shared architecture traditions extending beyond the present-day political boundaries. Likewise, looking at architecture traditions with a historic perspective has made it possible to perceive ancestral forms from present-day architectural practices in distant past cultures, exemplifying the continuum in past. It is thus evident that the vernacular architecture of the traditional rural areas, while being representative of common values of present-day local communities, at the same time stands as a universal asset of common heritage. However, unlike visual attractive monumental buildings, perception and evaluation of this heritage is highly dependent on documentary studies. Developing an appreciation of the rural heritage signifies a holistic perspective embracing all social levels instead of restricted approach by considering only monumental buildings and historic urban centers of high cultures. Oh, sorry. These are some examples. As it is the case in most other countries, conventional farming communities are disappearing very rapidly also in Turkey. Processes of industrialization and mechanical farming, as well as the new modalities in agricultural practices, have led to radical changes in the setup of traditional villages without going through successful stages of adaptation. For example, narrow streets of traditional villages are not suitable for motor vehicles. It is also apparent that the maintenance of traditional building materials such as mud brick, wood, or stone becoming increasingly difficult, and through time, owners leave their buildings to decay and to collapse. However, these are the last remaining survivors of this delicate heritage. It is also detailed analysis of this heritage that we can assess adaptive strategies of rural communities, tracing the changing in the modalities of interaction with their natural environment. On the other hand, such regional studies are of seminal consequences in displaying how local communities living in similar environments have developed alternate adaptive strategies, making it possible to override simplistic linear vision of rural communities. We consider that as architects, we can learn from the solutions devised by rural communities in constructing. Architecture without architects is to be considered as an indispensable component of the architectural learning. Now, through presenting an overview of our study of the rural architecture traditions in northwestern Turkey, Eastern Thrace, and Urfa region in southeastern Anatolia, we shall try to surface its contribution to our perception of architectural practices and, more significantly, in opening up new queries. Our work in Eastern Thrace, initiating in 1997 and still continuing, through this long-lasting undertaking, along with documentation, we have been able to observe changing patterns in the modalities of rural structure and how it was reflected in architectural practices. Our work in Eastern Thrace was conducted at 85 villages located either in or in the periphery of the Istranca Mountains area, and the surveyed area is about 2,500 square kilometers. Even though oak forests cover the Istranca region, displaying a notably homogeneous environment, diversity in local architectural practices is astounding. One-story or two-story buildings, massive and solid buildings, or houses with semi-open spaces, masonry, timber frame, or mixed structures, and we have to mention especially wattle and top structures are very common in this region. And crack-like structures. We know this type of structures from medieval houses of England. It is so-called crack buildings. Because the structural system of these buildings in Thrace are similar to crack buildings, so we use the term crack-like buildings for these structures. Firstly, we documented all these different types of buildings in the entire region, and here I want to explain architectural features of these three houses. They are located in a close vicinity in Thrace. For example, this house is located in the dense forest area. It is a one-story house. It has a very high roof covered with thatch. It has an entrance hall and two living rooms. Behind this, there is a big workshop area. The height of the rooms is only 2 meters. The workshop space does not have a ceiling under the roof. The height of this space is more than 4 meters. As the roof is very high, the upper side of the flat roof of the rooms is used as floor for storage. The north, east, and west walls are masonry, but the south wall, the entrance side of the building, is wattle and top structure. And this house is located in the southern slopes of the mountains area. It is a 2-story building. It has a low pitch roof covered with tiles. The ground floor is for animals. The second floor is for living. There are rooms and a big workshop space. The main body of the building is masonry, but the southwestern corner is made of woodland dub structure. This house is located in the southern slopes of the mountainous area. It is a low pitch roof covered with tiles. This one-story house has a semi-open corridor in front of the rooms. All the rooms are open to this corridor. They don't have interior connection. Like previous ones, its northern walls are masonry, but the south facade is woodland dub structure. And when we think about the diversity of the architecture, one of the reasons is the variety of the building material. There is oak in the forest, limestone and andesite in the rocky areas, earth and reeds around the rivers. All these materials are useful for building materials. And the traditional demography of the region should be also considered. There have been Turkish, Greek and Bulgarian villages in the history. The first house that I shown you is a Bulgarian house, the second one is a Greek house, and the third one is a Turkish house. As you know, from 18th to 20th century, Ottoman Empire has lived a lot of wars all over the country. During this process, communities from Caucasus, Crimea, and especially from all over the Balkan Peninsula moved to this region. In the beginning of 20th century, the Greek and Bulgarian communities left the area. So the newcomers sometimes established their own villages in their own tradition. Sometimes they have been settled in abandoned villages. So they lived in these villages, and during time they transformed the buildings according to their tradition. Or they used the old buildings and built the new houses in their own tradition. For example, in Kaynarca village, because of the population exchange agreement in 1923, the Greek house was given to an immigrant Turkish family. In time, when the family needed more space for their children, they constructed a new house in their own tradition in the courtyard. This is a very typical West Thrace Turkish house. So we can say that, like the towns, villages can be multi-layered as well. In the region, we especially focus on crack-like buildings. In Turkey, the crack system is not known from Anatolia. It is unique for Thrace region. Because of this reason, we documented all the different types of the structural system, and this is the interior of a crack-like building. These are examples. For example, these are huts. They are round or ovoid-shaped buildings. And these are barns, haylofts, and they are linear-shaped buildings. There are sheepfolds. They are in curvilinear form. This structural system is suitable for creating different forms in architecture. Our study on the architectural heritage of the region has indicated that the crack-like structures that we had encountered in Eastern Thrace was a practice widespread beyond the present political borders in Greece and in Bulgaria. Accordingly, developing a mutual understanding on shared architectural heritage is possible only by holistic approaches working beyond the borders. One other significant outcome of our work in Eastern Thrace has been to view the connection between the wattle and dub architectural practices of our times with that of the distant past. What we have observed in the present-day villages of the Istranca region is almost identical to the early prehistoric cultures of not only of Turkey but also of a much wider geographic region extending to most of the Balkans. Our study has revealed how the use of wattle and dub architecture was practiced and evolved through a period of over 8,000 years. Here you can see the architectural remains of Ashapınar excavations in Eastern Thrace in Turkey. This is our excavation and our reconstitution study for the wattle and dub walls. And here you can see the reconstitution drawings of these building remains. So these are the houses of Ashapınar in 5000 BC. The forms of those buildings resembles those of rural structures of our times, enabling to link the past with the present, if not culturally, at least on the basis of technologies implemented through several millennia. We might also conclude that the remnants of present-day village architecture constitute a time lapse in visualizing the architectural remains of the distant past. And our second study area has been the western part of the Urfa province. There, within the framework of an inventorying program, we have surveyed 413 villages distributed in an area of about 1,700 square kilometers and documented the traditional rural buildings of the region. And our lovely colleague Ege Olduca Tümer has also joined to our study for one season in that time. Here you can see some examples of the buildings, mud brick structures, masonry structures, one-story, two-story buildings, and parts of the region extending along the valley of Euphrates and the plain of Suruç are mostly alluvial flatlands separated by undulating plateau occasionally broken by rocky outcrops. At present, the region displays steppe conditions being devoid of any forest cover. This is a very typical view of the region. And our work in the Urfa region has revealed the presence of three basic plan types. The first, flat-roofed, long rectangular structures with entrances usually from the center. The second, with open porch entrance, the so-called Ivan, again flat-roofed type. Third type is a multi-roomed structure, almost cellular, each unit being closed with a conical dome. In this respect, in strong contrast to that of Thrace, the region displayed a notable homogeneity in types of rural structures being reserved to the above-mentioned three plan types. This uniformity of structural types in view of dynamic population movements that took place throughout historic times as well as at present, we have found to be a considerable interest. An example for long rectangular buildings, this is a very simple flat-roofed house, just one room and two ovens, one inside, the other one is outside of the building. The building is a pure basic prismatic form, but the triple arch facade is quite decorative. This is a house compound of a family. Each building has a different function: house units, guest room, stable, barn, sheepfold, and they surround a courtyard. This house compound contains all the units of a small-size enterprise of traditional agricultural economy. And another example for flat-roofed rectangular houses. So-called cellular houses, or also named as pseudo-domed mud brick houses, are one of the basic plan type of the region. The domed structures are located mainly in the Suruç Basin. We observed in 139 rural settlements such kinds of structures. Here you can see some examples of domed structures. In 2002, we counted 2,760 domes in the entire region. The domed constructions are formed by the juxtaposition of small square spacious units of 4 meters in length maximum. The articulation of units may form huge complexes. A domed dwelling may also contain places for food production, guest rooms, workshops, storage rooms, haylofts, barns, and stables. Here you can see some different functional parts of a household. Interior of the domed spaces. At the top of the dome, there is a hole. It's actually a flue. As there is an oven in the center of the room, this hole is used as a chimney actually. Along with field documentation considering these types of structures as cultural indicators, our study also covered defining their distribution in space and in time. It is also interesting to note that Sir Layard, while working on the archaeology of this region, had documented a village entirely of similar domed structures in the vicinity of Aleppo in 1853. Likewise, Edward Wanze, a German explorer working in the region in 1912, had noted that domed structures had a distribution area from Suruç and Harran plains in the north to Aleppo, Hama, and Homs in the south. A postcard that shows the domed structures in Suruç plain in the turn of the 20th century. Copeland had also documented domed structures in Syria in 1950s. Thus, it is evident that until recent, this type of structures was common in a considerably large area, regardless of ethnic origins or local communities. It is also interesting to note that almost similar dome structures has been depicted on the reliefs recovered in the Palace of Senshab Sharif, dated to 7th century BC at the Koyunjuk Mount, ancient Nineveh. Archaeological excavations can reveal only the foundations of the buildings. The base relief of Nineveh is highly informative, providing for the first time the historic depth of such structures. Thus, it is possible to surmise that such dome structures sustained to be used in the region either in villages or in palaces. And when we focus on building material sources of the region, even a preliminary assessment of the building material indicates the use of materials within the close vicinity of the settlements, mud brick in alluvial plains, and stone in the region of rocky outcrops. The region is devoid of trees, wooden beams that define the extent of rectangular rooms in flat roof type has to be brought in from distant regions. Several researchers had associated the presence of dome structure of the unavailability of wood to be used in roofing. A brief survey of historic background indicates that the region had been settled by communities of different identity or of origin. Moreover, the presence of settlements of previous semi-nomadic groups is also evident. In strong contrast to Thrace, where newcoming groups had introduced their type of construction to the region, in southeastern Turkey, the prevailing type sustained to be in use in spite of changes in the composition of the population. And to conclude, our work in rural areas has led to define and to develop the scope of research questions that enables understanding conventional buildings. The detailed documentation and the historic data have provided queries that had to be considered previously, and some can be summarized, such as, for example, about the design criteria. Firstly, defining the interface between possibilities and restrictions defined by environmental conditions and simple rational solutions devised by communities, primarily based on employing local materials. Secondly, eventually reaching optional settings to cover requirements of a way of living dependent on farming and animal husbandry. Thirdly, what could be devised or inspired through the study of architectures without architects can be transmitted to a number of entities, including ecological architecture and sustainable design. Our experience based on rural architecture has been a source of inspiration both at theoretical dimension and as well as in practical issues, providing opportunities in testing various modalities. And about the cultural and historic perspective, firstly, it is possible to define shared cultural assets of past cultures regardless of present-day political boundaries. Secondly, even if there would be changes in the composition of local population, structural components distinctive to that particular region can sustain to be in use. Thirdly, sequential development of villages can be as complex as towns, with time becoming multi-layered, thus they should not be viewed through a simple flat historic perspective. Evolution of a village can be as complex and multidimensional as the urban centers. Cultural and historic perspective clearly indicates the value of rural architecture as a cultural asset, necessitating protection and detailed documentation. In an overview, it seems that archaeologists, social anthropologists, and ethnographers have developed more interest on rural architecture than architects. Evidently, rural architecture is a field where distinct disciplines to work, eventually each stimulating the other. However, protection and preservation still stands as an indispensable responsibility of the architect. Rural architecture is under great pressure. We can now account changes in way of living, industrialization, etc. as conventional threats. However, now armed conflicts and even earthquakes, natural disasters are having devastating impact, and as architects, we now have to face new responsibilities, the custodians of the rural architectural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eres. It's really exciting to see the variety of Turkish vernacular houses which are designed in harmony with climate, topography, environment, and even social and cultural needs over time. And there's a lot to learn out of the rural architecture or vernacular architecture in Turkey, just like in other places in the world. Now we move to West Africa as a case area. I would like to give the screen to Dr. Toki Lawton-Brown. She is actually joining us but from, are you located at the moment in Italy or in Slovenia?
In Nigeria at the moment.
Nigeria at the moment, okay. Dr. Toki is a scientific member of Scientific Committee Graduate Program in Cultural Heritage Studies at the University of Nova Gorica, Slovenia. And she is also representing ICOMOS Nigeria for us today. So please, Dr. Toki.
Okay, I will just share my slide. Sorry about the mix-up because I was trying to figure it out. So
if you just click on it, it will go.
Yeah, I got it the last time, so I was hoping that I will get it.
At the top, you have the share button.
Yes, I've done that. I'm just looking for it now. Let me just see.
It should be at the top right.
Oh no, I have that. I'm just finding it now.
Your presentation.
Yes, I'm just. Okay, so trying to find that. Apologies, and I have it now. Attach. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm trying to see how I can get that. Do I hide? Okay, does that work? Can everyone see it?
It's okay. We see the screen, but if you want to move to try, if you want to try to change slides, if it works or not.
To change slides. Oh, the layout, is it?
No, I mean it's okay now, but I don't know if your slides will move.
All right, okay, so that was what I was trying to understand. Okay, my name is Dr. Toki Lawton-Brown. I work in Africa with through my organization, Merging Ecologies. I also represent ICOMOS. I'm a voting member on ICOMOS ISCCL. I'm also a member on ICOMOS Nigeria, and I'm also on the SDGs working group in ICOMOS. And I want to talk about the traditional building materials and climatic challenges that we're facing in West Africa. And we're now looking at the use of clay and timber as an alternative. Well, reclaiming those materials as we used to have them then. So this presentation will take us, on a journey from pre-modern to modern to beyond modern. What do we do within this space? What are the uses of new technology to enhance traditions that we've had over years, right? So art and culture of our built environment in West Africa. And this story of the impact of modernization what it has done to Africa, West Africa, not only in architecture, but also within climate change. And so we step forward from this understanding of an enhanced approach with an important reference to traditional reclamation on a journey of past experiences towards a place where we can find new pastures with old construction materials. So this was when I went to Calabar and I saw how the men were laying those bricks. And it made me realize that theorize or measure or gather results as heritage designers, because most of the time I see myself as a heritage architect as opposed to, you know, the traditional ways of seeing architecture. So that means, okay, I think somebody's waiting. Okay. As opposed to just following the norm. So now it means we have to understand the role traditional materials have on contemporary Afrocentric buildings, which is what we're looking to do, and how these materials will adapt reasonably well to climate circumstances, because we can see that there's a lot of climate changes now, even in West Africa and in Africa, especially in West Africa, where we're in the tropics, where it rains a lot. And so in various parts of these regions, we see that there is now a need to have low energy designed building standards, which will help shape the provision for occupant comfort and well-being. And this must include the process of climate zoning, which is what we don't have currently, collection of data, because we come from oral narrations, so we don't have an adequate means of collecting data. And so systematic analysis is something we need to start working on, and in situ surveys, which I think is very important, that we use a lot of what's happening on the ground to feed that data collection. Again, building simulation tools, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, because the way people react to buildings on the ground is different from what we think they should react. So again, understanding user perspective when it comes to buildings. And so we find that we have a lot of stick buildings, because from ancient times we were using earth, then we moved into cement. And then from cement, we've developed what we have, stick building syndromes, where we are now using generators, loads of generators all over the place. We're using loads of air conditioning, which affects user well-being within these sick buildings. And so now reclaiming earth and making people understand that you can still have your modern buildings, but you can use natural materials that we've been using. And then the issue of the types of buildings that we now build. Initially, we always had courtyards. Now we've seen courtyards, we've lost the whole idea of courtyards now, because of the influx of designs from other countries that are not typical of the environment in which we live in. And now making people go back to the idea of using courtyard designs in their design concepts. So occupants of the building, these buildings that need to be assessed, their adaptive reactions to their varying thermal perceptions are lost, and this is what we need to bring back. Another issue is defining Afrocentric architecture, modern day Afrocentric architecture, as part of traditional culture, which means we need to emphasize on the adaptation to natural and social norms of its locality. So if we're in Lagos, we need to understand the cultural and social norms of being a Lagosian and include the traditional norms as well. And that should influence the designs that we come up with in places like Lagos or Abuja or Ghana in Accra, any of these places, but understanding the cultural norms of this that has existed over time. So when we talk about clay, right now I've started a project where I'm training young people to learn how to ram it. And so this is an example of what we've been doing on the ground. So it's funny how we have the villagers come, and tell us what they have suddenly remembered. Oh, this is how we used to do it. Oh, really? So you can make designs. Oh, this looks beautiful. So maybe we should have people come do something in our own compounds. So suddenly we see a mindset shift, because now they can touch it, they can see it, they can see how sustainable this is, which means the material is in, in their surrounding. They see the socio-economic impact of this rammed wall. And then you also see the community impact, because now we have loads of community members coming to touch this wall. We had an instance, I forgot to put that picture, where a tree fell on this rammed earth wall while they were building, and everyone was like, oh, it didn't crack. It was just 2 days old. And they were like, oh my God, it's still standing. And we're like, yes, it's still standing. And they're like, wow, okay, you know what? Maybe I'm fully convinced now that you can come to my compound and do something like this. So it means that a lot of people would love to use clay or earth, for their buildings, but because it's forgotten, it's a forgotten memory. Now we're in what's the English word now? we're showing that this can be modernized. So we're bringing it to modern age, but the same material. So we do understand that they don't want to have the circular huts anymore. They want to have modern day architecture, but we need to show them how to use earth to do that. And these are some of the ways of showing how to use clay in communities. And in the proverb you can see here, I say, however far the stream flows, it never forgets its source, right? So this has helped with memory of bringing back what used to be the norm and bringing that into pre-modern architecture or the built environment. So when we talk about clay, there are impacts for, the positive of the well-being of the community once it's widely accepted. So we need a wide acceptance. We need this community impact to yield good returns, because this is what we're trying to promote to the community. We need the use of these materials to show that there's a net zero return in future, because that's what they want to know. We need the streams of income that this building or this material can produce are, well, I would like to say endless, but it's a work in progress. And we need to have hubs that show this, hubs that are of this material, for the arts, for culture, and for gatherings. And so place for the African means a mindset appropriated by mood, right? So for them, it's a mood, it's a satisfaction, it's an association and of comfort. So within the timeline of a human being, this lived experience of place for an African changes from in the womb, in the arms, in the cradle, the bed, the mother's home, warmed by the sun, staring at the fire, quietly sitting in an enclosed corner, the exuberance of a feast, right? The inclusion in ceremonies, the participation in meetings, a discourse of opinions. So whether we agree or not, but everyone is interjecting, but that's okay. But that's the whole idea of communal building, right? So the sovereignty of barriers, with all of those present in enclosed special blankets, because this is the significance of an African culture within the built environment, because we place a lot of emphasis on intangible heritage as opposed to the tangible. So this intangible heritage is what is important. And so during all the key stages of an African site, a site's development, we have a described phenomena, right, and occurrences which are not always positive, but the intuition, knowledge, and experience informed appropriate reaction. And these reactions becomes its accumulated references for future manifestations of this type of architecture. So the inspiration, the intentions, and the expectations should be reflected in the African building. And so when we talk about the African building, when we go back into history and we see how it was done in history, we see the roof and wall detail of an indigenous house, how landed settlements demonstrate this within the fabric of their built environment. So we see I'm going to use some traditional words. So we see wooden beams, supported by an ibatia, right, which runs entirely the length of the earth building. We see the intong, the bamboo rafters. The beam itself is supported by an abia, which is a type of wooden column within the earth wobble and double system. We see the rafter, we see the beam support, we see the indumia, or the purlin-like components which hold up the roof coverings. The thatch, which is called an inkenya, is used as a roof covering produced from the raffia palm stems that have been specifically cut in strips called indubongas. So these are all the things that come with the building, and the whole process of thatching, the indigenous intangible heritage that goes with it, shows that it's only during the time of when we harvest the raffia that it's being used, and that's when we maintain during the time of abundance, right? We do not do that when we have a loss, when it's not in abundance, because it affects the environment. And so following the circles of when we have the materials to build was important, which we're losing, or which basically we've lost. Now we've gone to logging woods at wrong timings, which is affecting our environment. Now we log and send to China. This affects our climate changes. This is an effect of the climate changes we're seeing. We're seeing that we're losing a lot of these materials, and the environment is having this impact from this loss. And because we no longer follow the circles, we see that even with what is happening today with climate change. And so it's important that when we go back into the built environment, that we continue to follow the circles so that we keep the impacts to a bare minimum when we go back to our environmentally supported materials when building. I'm going to give an example of a building that we're currently working on in Calabar as well. So this is the premier building. It was built in 1895, and this is what it looked like over the years because of climate change and because it was a pure wooden timber prefab building that was actually import export from Scotland. So this is Scottish pine, which is not of this environment because they have their own wood. So we were quite particular about why they didn't use the pine or the wood in Calabar, because they had their own wood. They have the Iroko and the black Afara. So we were surprised that, okay, fine, we needed to restore this building. What are we going to do? Because the whole idea of restoration means that you use like for like. How do you use like for like in an environment where the wood that was imported isn't the wood of that region? And we have seen all the decaying processes, because this is an area where there's heavy rainfall, and we could see through the interventions that there was a lot of zinc that was used to protect that wood. So we decided that, okay, it is still timber we're using, but we're going to use the indigenous wood to work our way through this building. And currently, we've been using the black Afara. And we have seen that this has been working quite well with the climate because the wood is of that region. And the people had a traditional way of preserving the Afara black wood. And that's what we've been using, traditional methods of preserving the timber before using it on site. I do not have the finished product yet because we're still working on it, but these are just some of the issues that you face when you're working on site and you're working with the community. You tend to learn a lot more about the climate because the people understand all of this. And then we noticed that there are a lot of clerestory windows around and a lot on the veranda as well. And the people said it's not typical for them to use verandas for their own wooden buildings. What they did was pull out a full-on floor platform on the ground floor because people tended to do their ceremonies on the ground floor, not high up in the air, you know? So that's not the tradition. The tradition is to have the ceremonies on the ground floor because that keeps you grounded, not suspended in the air. So now we hit another break, because what do we do now? Because the original building that was brought in had this suspended veranda in the air. And so we said, okay, we wouldn't turn that into an events hall because they named what they wanted to do with the building once it's restored. What we'll do is show what it looked like, keep that limited. So that could be something for classrooms that they could use later. But for the events, we use the ground floor and then extend the ground floor for them to have their ceremonies and still keep in tune of the cultural, you know, aspirations for the community, because that's what they wanted. And so we're sort of combining the treatment approach for the building by using the principles, the ICOMOS principles for wood restoration, but also merging that with what the community, through community engagement, what they actually want to see, because they're the ones who are going to use the building. We do not want to make the building ineffective in a way that they will not be able to use the building because of their cultural impacts in regards to use of this building. And this is what we're hoping that the building would look like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. An interesting journey in West Africa, and seeing all these vernacular examples. And I think it's really what you are doing, like trying to change the mindset shift, or change the mindset basically, for remembering the traditional ways of constructing. Anyway, I will have some questions, but let's go to our last but not the least speaker. Thank you. Dr. Ege Uluca Tümer from she's going to be presenting Cyprus vernacular architecture and settlements to us. Ege Uluca Tümer is an associate professor in Department of Architecture of Eastern Mediterranean University, and she is she's an expert on restoration and conservation studies. Yes, Ege Hocam, please.
Yes, I'm sharing my presentation.
Yeah.
I think it's there. Hello, everybody. Now we are coming back to Cyprus, our little island. Yeah, even though it's a little island, we should say that the building technologies information in vernacular buildings is not less than any other place. We have a lot to learn from our vernacular architecture. I'm going to talk about the houses in Messaria today. Messaria is the plain in Cyprus, and there are many villages in this area, starting from very early periods. This plain is a very populous plain. It's in between Famagusta and Nicosia, our capital city. And it was always, let's say, a populated area because it gave the, let's say, chance of a lot of production of agricultural goods. Because of the deforestation and limited water sources, we now only produce grains, not the other agricultural goods. We see that since the 12th century in this region, there have been a dense network of villages. And there had been the largest towns and villages, including capital city Nicosia in this area. And during British period, it was let's say, an area where the railroads was passing through from 1904 to 1950s. And Also, let's say this railway was carrying the agricultural goods to Famagusta port, which was the most active port in that period. I'm going to talk about the climatic conditions in this area. I'm going to talk about the production economy and lifestyle, the structure and the materials in this area. And I'm going to talk about the main spatial and architectural components, then the environmental responsive design features and existing problems. This area is a very hot area, and during summer, the temperatures are around 40 degrees, which is very uncomfortable for living, and it prevents the peasants from doing their daily works. So the hot weather is the most challenging issue in this area, we can say that. And also the scarcity of water during the hot seasons is another challenge. And of course, it affected the design of the buildings and also the roofs. So as we have said, grain production and animal husbandry were the main economic activities in Mesaria villages. So the rural residential buildings were mostly developed due to the needs of these production facilities. So we see that there have been built many storage spaces for the grains and barns, and these were mostly in the premises of the houses, and also open spaces for the processes of dairy production, drying the fruits, vegetables, tarhana, which is the cracked wheat, and yogurt for the soup for winter. And the materials are very similar to the materials that we have discussed in the previous presentations. Adobe is the main building material, which was the most available and the easiest to produce and the cheapest one. So mud brick walls were built on top of the rubble stone foundations in this area. And the timber beams were used for flat mud roofs or slightly inclined pitch roofs. Stone was used, as we have said, for foundations or the doors and windows, surrounds, veranda and roof supporting arches and foundations, as we have said. And beams of flat and pitch roofs, windows and doors were the timber elements of these buildings. So we see that mud brick use is very widely there. We have some stone, and mainly we have the wood for the roofs and the architectural elements on the facade. Iron is very rare. We see the use of iron only in late periods in the 19th century. And the mud brick walls, masonry walls, were around 50 centimeters thick. The arcades and roof supporting arches were cut stone. We see cut stone there. This is an example of Mesaria houses. This is from Akdeniz Lisi. And we can see the use of mud brick on the side wall where the plaster has been detached. And here we can see again another mud brick masonry wall where the roof has collapsed. And we see the doors and the stone surroundings around them. The doors were wooden. We see some of them have changed. Again, we see another example of a timber door and stone surroundings. This is the iron railings from the late period houses, balconies. And I want to talk about the main architectural components, main spaces in these buildings. We see that there is a very modular design in these buildings. Room is the main unit, and it can be arrayed in linear order on the ground floor due to the increasing demand or according to the wealthness of the owners. We can have more rooms, we can have one room, we can have 2, 3, 4, it can increase, but it's a linear organization, we can say. In the early periods, we used to have an upper story It was mainly a single room, and it was called Hanay in Cypriot Turkish. It's a very important space. I'm gonna talk about it more later on. And we see that the layout of these attached rooms are on east-west direction. So the southern facades have faced the courtyard, and the northern facades were facing the streets with less openings. And there were singular span rooms, which were named makrinari in Greek. And there were some rooms with a beam or an arch supporting the roof, and they were called dikoro. These arches and beams are very important in these buildings. We see this arch not only in the villages of Mesaria, but we see them everywhere in the cities or in the mountainous villages too. So in later periods, we see that this linear plan organization has become more compact, and arcaded porticos disappeared, and a central inner hall has been developed, and a number of first-story rooms have increased. Iliakos in Greek, it's a very, very important, let's say, space. We have seen in the presentation related with the city in Jordan, the arcaded portico. This is the most prominent and characteristic feature of Mesaria village houses. These porticos, which were placed on south, they were life-saving during summer and winter. These were the semi-open spaces. They were used for circulation and as activity areas, and they were used both for recreational or work-oriented facilities, because during summer, because the sun was coming from top, it was shady, and during winter, because the sun was lower, it was a very sunny area. And Iliakos in Greek means solar or solar collector. And this name is used in Cyprus mainly, in Greek for these spaces as a sun collector. So it's very appropriate for the spacing, this naming. The depth of these arcaded porticos were like 3 meters. And then in later buildings, we see that this changed, and these arcades have disappeared. And instead, we had another space. In, again, Turkish Cypriot, we call it sündürme. It's a vestibule, and it's very close to an entrance A1. And this sündürme had the rooms on both sides. It's like an inner sofa. And sometimes we have a single space on top of it, again, which is called hanay. Here we see these different organizations on left and right. We can see the Iliakos or the portico, arcaded portico on the left side, and we can see the sündürme in between the rooms on the right side. As I say, the right side buildings were starting from the 19th century, and the left ones were earlier ones. And now we see an example of the early period houses. We can see that there are arches, and there is a space behind. As we say, it's shady in the summer and sunny in the winter, and it's the main space that they use throughout the day. They do their activities here, and they use it for sitting, eating, producing, whatever. And also, as we have said, you can see here how these spaces were built. The arches were built using cut stone, and the roof was continuing on top of this arcaded porticos, and you can see the holes in between the arches, which was again for ventilation of the space under the ceiling. So that was, and also they used to have similar openings on 2 sides of the walls. So these openings were providing cross ventilation. You know, the wind was coming in through these holes, and you can check the wall behind. You can see the similar holes on the walls behind these arcs, and also the north facades. So the prevailing wind was being activated through these holes on the walls. This is a late period house with an inner hall or sündürme, and you can see its simplest form and the most widespread form. You can see it in Mesaria houses, and you can see this organization, this plan layout in many other places in Cyprus. And we see the Hanay as a single space on top of it. Hanay is a very important space because during night, it provides a breezy environment. So for sleeping, it's very comfortable during the hot summer nights. And you know, they were not everywhere. There were some like tower spaces. So it was very easy for them to take the prevailing wind. We can see another example. You see that there were windows on four sides of these spaces. And then in latest examples, we see that the sündürme in the middle of the ground floor was repeated on the first story. So the rooms on both sides were repeated on the top floor, and a balcony was added to these buildings. So the roof supporting arcs, it's a very important element of the plan. We can see some examples of them. We see some examples with large beams to support the roof, but these white arcs are much more common than the beams, because it was not so easy to find big beams of the trees. And I think they were very skilled in building these wide span arcs. So we see that they use these arcs in both directions, you know, in the middle, just under the pitch of the roof, or the other direction. We can see again another interior arch supporting the roof. And the roofs were flat or slightly inclined because there were no heavy rainfalls or snow. Reed buttons have been used on top of the timber beams in both cases. On top of the flat roofs, mud roofing materials have been used. And then they started to use terracotta tiles. It's a later, let's say, usage. We can see how these reeds were placed on the rafters, and some, let's say, mud was coming on top of it, and this mud was like a mortar. They were not. I listened to the villagers, and they said that 1 year they were using the wet mud mortar, and 1 year they were using just the earth. So they were doing a periodical maintenance to these roofs to keep them well insulated. We can see again some examples of the roofs. Courtyards, yes, there are courtyards in the village, but their borders are not very easy to define. Most of the, let's say, garden walls have disappeared. So, but of course, they were using these open spaces, especially for ovens, storage rooms, for daily activities, for wells, daily cleaning works, and agricultural production activities. So what do we have as environmentally responsive design features here? We have thick mud brick walls, minimum 50 centimeters thick. We have wooden shutters. We have a semi-open A1 type sündürmes on south, creating a cooling effect. We have south-oriented arcaded porticos providing shade during summer and sunlight during the winter. We have the openings on west, letting the western wind, which is the prevailing wind in the area. We have mud flat roofs with high insulation capacity. We have Hanay spaces on top, open on all sides. no preventions of winds during night for a comfortable sleep, ventilation holes under roof eaves for ventilating through south-north axis. We can see a sündürme, which is like A1, open to courtyard on the south for ventilation in summer. And of course, we have some problems related with preserving these buildings. Many of them have been lost. They are not still listed. No legislation related with these buildings, no awareness. They're continuously being, let's say, demolished. And unfortunately, the knowledge of the local building technologies are not available anymore, so they don't know how to continue the maintenance of these buildings. The ones who use these buildings, they use them only as barns for animals or as storage. They do incompatible interventions, and of course, mud brick, which always needs to be plastered. When it loses its plaster, it starts to be much more fragile, and there is abandonment due to incapabilities of repairing, immigration to towns, believing that new buildings are more comfortable and more fancy. So we see that there have been many wrong interventions, like to arcades on south, or many of them are abandoned, not in use, so they started to collapse because the maintenance is not going on. Again, we see they are falling apart in many parts. They are locked. They are not in use. And unfortunately, we are losing, let's say, the local skills. We are losing the understanding of building in these local ways. We are, let's say, losing the chance to understand their capabilities for, let's say, more ecological living, more sustainable living. And thank you very much for listening this presentation.
Thank you very much, Ege Hoca. Again, there is a lot to learn from the vernacular in Cyprus, just like elsewhere in the world. And unfortunately, I think it would have been very interesting if you showed us the contemporary housing examples and how much they are contrasting with the vernacular and how much we don't learn from those traditional construction techniques and their value and their actually contribution to climatic issues. In all contemporary houses, we use air conditioning in almost every room, every space, and imagine economically and environmentally how much this is destroying the environment and the earth in general. So this was a kind of tour in the region from Jordan to Turkey and to West Africa to Cyprus. We had a nice tour with the contribution of our speakers. So I would like to open up discussions. If you have any questions, any comments, you can raise hands, you can turn on your microphones. If you want, you can also turn on your cameras. If you have any comments or any questions to our speakers. Oh, hi, Pınar Hoca. You are muted. You are muted.
Thank you very much, Şebnem Hoca. I know you are one of the organizers with Ege Hoca. Thank you very much for all this effort, and thank you for the colorful palette of vernacular, I think, from around the world. Thank you to our guest speakers. I was thinking when you were presenting, and of course, recently having visits to both urban and rural areas in, for example, Cyprus. Of course, I come to realize how much different each house is from one another. I think this is obviously more apparent in urban areas in Cyprus, but I don't know. Of course, you would, the speakers would answer this question in different locations around the world. But it seems to me, of course, in rural areas as well, we have these differences, but there's more maybe uniformity in rural areas than in urban areas. Urban areas maybe has got its more cultural, rich heritage, which gives each house a uniqueness. And when you enter one from the other, you notice that they are never the same. And I think this is what's so much interesting about these houses. So, I mean, I don't know, this is to the speakers. Is there such a difference between urban and rural spatial richness in, for example, residential architecture?
That's an open question to all speakers. Do you mind turning on your cameras, our guest speakers, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that while I was watching everyone else's presentations, I already noticed the differences in like rural areas that, you know, that has been presented by the other speakers, while mine was more of an urban, very dense urban fabric, which I've already noticed that there are some challenges in urban fabrics that are maybe less than the rural areas, especially when we think about, you know, changing that mindset of local communities and understanding their user perspective. So, for example, if we are to look at courtyards, you know, solutions in a city such as a Salt, which is a very dense urban fabric, with each meter square, it makes a difference. So people have been adopting in a way that economic pressure has led them to, you know, design floors for each son of them when he gets married. So they've just built a new floor. So that makes it almost impossible to have a courtyard, you know, on the rear or in the middle. So, and actually the new buildings emerging in the city fabric were actually located in the old courtyards or in old open yards in the, on that heritage building. So that's why they are now more integrated now more than ever, so that you will see modern building, a heritage building, and then a modern building, because those modern buildings were built in the courtyards of the old buildings. So it adds way more to the economic pressure. It adds way more to, you know, being very close to the streets and all of that I haven't seen in the other presentations.
I would like to say something. So we're currently designing a rammed earth, zero energy, net zero.
Zero energy.
Zero energy, carbon neutral building in a city. So we do have courtyards in the middle, but it is actually all through to the floor, to the rooftop. So that's how we've integrated it, to have the stack ventilation and to have the windows within the interior of it and the exterior. So it's just showing people that it's possible to add the floors with the courtyards, and people will generally will follow the trend once they see it.
Maybe I can also join the conversation. Actually, my speech was totally about the richness and diversity of the rural settlements. In Thrace, for example, in a village, you can see very different types of architecture, and it has many reasons. So we cannot easily say that in urban areas the architecture is more has more diversity, and in rural areas it is more unique. And also in urban areas the architecture can be also homogeneous, so that we can prepare typology studies. So we cannot easily say that villages are simple and one layered settlements and the urbans are not so. In villages we can see lots of differences. Also in a village we can see lots of differences. But the main point is, firstly, we have to study individuals very detailed, and we have to make analysis, not only the structural system, not only the design concept, but also the history and the archaeological remains. All of them are important for understanding present-day villages. Thank you.
I want to say a few words about this too. For rural architecture, and we cannot say that urban architecture is richer than rural architecture, of course, but we can say that maybe the urban architecture was more open to exterior, let's say, interventions. And for example, if we look at the cities in Cyprus and the villages in Cyprus, the cities were maybe having different groups of people, and it was more open to external, let's say, effects. A port city, different people are coming and going, more cosmopolitan. So maybe if there was a trend in the world, Famagusta had a chance to be affected from it. But a village in Messaria continued to produce its own local necessities, maybe more dependent on the needs rather than the trends. And it comes to me like it was much more genuine and much more, let's say, much more developed according to the needs of that local climate, local production, local needs, and has a lot to learn from, because they found the solutions, the common people, ordinary people, they found the solutions throughout centuries, the most appropriate solutions for that local area. So I think that's really valuable, and that there is a lot to learn from rural architecture.
Yeah, so just to clarify, it has never been said that it's simpler or not. It's the thing is the challenges are different even in rural areas. So one rural area has different challenges than the other. For example, if one rural area has masonry that are the quarries are now closed, other rural area has wood and it's available still. So for example, even same rural areas have different circumstances. So the key is to just understand what is the climate in that area, what do people need, and then from that to take actions based on the best available solution in that specific context.
Of course, there is also the difference between urban way of living and rural way of living. The conditions or the lifestyles in the rural areas and urban areas, even the land value, the densely populated or undensely populated areas, and the production ways of production, ways of living, they're all influential in the development of the rural or urban architecture. But I totally agree that there is really a lot to learn from the traditional way of building rural architecture and vernacular architecture and settlement layouts in as I have seen in all parts of the world. I was going to ask to Dr. Toki, what are or what would be the reactions of architects and engineers for the reclaiming of clay and timber? Because you said the local people, they were very interested, but have you invited or did they come and see? I think that this is the most important thing, because at the moment architects, engineers, professionals are designing and are constructing. So and this will take us to education, our educational systems, that maybe we should really teach more of traditional ways of constructing rather than, or in addition to star architecture, this and that,
Oh, you hit something very important right there. Yeah. So a lot of the architects in, well, I will use Nigeria as an example because this is where I'm currently working in, and then Ghana as well, because I've heard stories as well when I took students to Ghana. The thing is that, again, I'm going to go straight to the education. So when we took the whole idea of construction, because before construction was communal, so everybody had roles within the built environment in the communities. So the men came in, they did all the hard work. The women came in, did all the paintings and the laying of floors, and the children got involved. So the educational process of the built environment was within the community. And so when we had colonization come in, we got interrupted. And so all of that built environment was taken out of the community and taken to schools. So now we have specializations of a built environment that usually it was the community that built for themselves according to their needs and according to their environment. So there we have this disconnect, because now we have architects and engineers that have a different mindset because of the schools and the type of training that they had imbibed in their design skills, which meant that whatever it is that they were taught in schools was based on Western ideology. So now that Western ideology began to disconnect with the whole process of the built environment. And then we started to have intrusive sick buildings based on that education. And so when we talk about architects and engineer training in Africa in general, we need to go back to the basics, because now, while I've been working on restoration, I couldn't find a structural engineer who knew anything about wood. I had problems finding because they kept saying, "Oh, really? You want to really? Don't you want to change the material? Because that's." And so it was horrible dealing with architects and engineers that had no clue. It's the same thing with rammed earth. They kept telling me I needed to put steel in the rammed earth for the columns. And I said, hell no, I'm not using that. That's not how it's done. And so these are the miseducation of the architects and the engineers that we have to deal with, because even with existing buildings that have earth in them or have timber in them, we're going to have, well, we are having problems because they don't know what to do with these buildings. They have no idea. And so we are having to train youths from the bare basics, you know, of what to do with wood, how to restore it and work with it, and then work with local artisans. So I have found that working with local artisans that work with wood, carpenters and all of them, much more experienced, because they have been working traditionally on these materials for a very long time, from generation to generation. So I found them much more experienced than the architects and the engineers that literally went to school for 6 years.
Thank you. And how is the case in Turkey, Zeynep Hocam? Did you work with architects in the regions that you work for? How are their reaction?
So we are working in the area as conservator architects. We are documenting the buildings, and we also try to understand the decay process of these buildings. And for conservation of these buildings, so in Turkey, the restoration process for urban architecture is quite well developed, but for rural buildings, the law system is totally prepared for urban architecture. And now in the last years, actually, the state also tried to restore some of these rural buildings, but with this law system, it is impossible. And also the architects and the civil engineers, if they are not educated for conservation, they don't know, of course, the traditional structural systems and as well as the traditional building materials. So because of that, there is also a problem in Turkey. So the architects and the civil engineers should be educated after their MA education, also in conservation sciences, and they have to learn the traditional structural systems and the traditional building materials. And also the law system should be suitable for these processes, not only the education.
I want to say something about this. Yes, as Zeynep Hoca says, it's really important to understand the conservation issue, but I think it's not only this. We have to learn about rebuilding buildings in the understanding of the vernacular buildings. Because if we consider the houses in villages, they were using local materials. They were using local work. The building materials were healthy. The buildings were healthy. They were very good for the local climate.
Yeah.
So, and they were durable. So, indeed, there is an ongoing knowledge that we have to relearn and we have to reapply, because this is much more sustainable for the world. This is much more sustainable for, let's say, economy, for social life. We are losing something, you know, we already lost indeed, and we have to recover it, because we now understand the modern technologies, modern building materials have many challenges, have many problems, especially when it comes to the rural area. So we don't have to use cement and reinforced concrete or steel everywhere. And it can be much more cheaper using the local materials, using the local work. And I think we need a new mindset. We need to understand that these are still usable. These are still can be valid according to our needs or comfort conditions. Besides the conservation, let's say, understanding and awareness, we need an awareness of building in the vernacular way. Thank you.
For Turkey, I always say rural heritage is like archaeological heritage. So the know-how is not continuing. We already lose this information. So like an archaeological site, we have to discover all the ancient data.
Yeah, and rural architecture is becoming like an ancient data. Already. Well, I was thinking all these, you know, vernacular architecture, actually, when they were designed and built, randomly, maybe not designed, but with the availability of the local construction techniques and local material, they were actually innovative for their periods, for you know, for their society. So considering that the architecture, the similar architecture, the apartment typology everywhere in the world is not innovative anymore. Maybe at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we had the concrete and so on, the new technologies, steel construction, they were. But nowadays we started repeating the same spatial organization, same techniques, same materials, same structural system. So there may be exceptions, but really rural and vernacular architecture were innovative in that sense. And considering the sustainable development goals, if we really, as Ege said, continue learning and designing in the way of traditional knowledge and construction, we will be reaching consumption, reasonable consumption, reasonable production. We will contribute to climate action. We will contribute to affordable and clean energy issues. So it is going to be really promoting achieving sustainable development goals not only one of them, but several of them, because it is going to definitely reduce the energy loss and increased consumption issues if we are aware and if we are sensitive to the environment in many ways. Are there any more comments or questions? We can, I know we can keep talking. There's a lot to say, but basically I don't want to take too much of the time of our speakers. We started a little bit late and we are leaving late. Well, kind of. I think there is a Oh, okay, Yonca Hoca, it was a great pleasure to listen to each presentations. There's an acknowledgement in the chat box. So I would like to thank you all who are here listening to the presentations, all our audience. I would like to thank our speakers. Thank you for taking us to the region, to the rich vernacular and traditional and rural architecture examples. And I would like to wish you all a happy International Day for Monuments and Sites. And hopefully we will meet again somewhere, somehow in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.